The summer of 1942 settled heavily over the small town of Red Hollow, Texas. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where dusty roads stretched endlessly between wooden houses, and where the sound of a passing truck could be heard from miles away. The town sat surrounded by dry fields and thick patches of oak trees, giving it a feeling of isolation from the rest of the world. Most people in Red Hollow had lived there their entire lives, and outsiders rarely passed through. It was peaceful, predictable, and quiet in a way that sometimes felt almost too quiet. At the edge of town stood an old wooden chapel. The building had once been the center of the community decades earlier, but by 1942 it had mostly been forgotten. Its white paint had faded and peeled under years of harsh Texas sun, and the tall wooden doors creaked loudly whenever the wind pushed against them. Broken stained glass windows cast strange colors across the dusty floor inside, and tall weeds had grown around the small graveyard behind it. Many locals avoided the place, especially after dark, saying the chapel always felt colder than the rest of the town. Despite the rumors surrounding the old building, most people in Red Hollow focused on their simple daily routines. Farmers woke before sunrise to tend their land, shop owners opened their doors along the town's narrow main street, and children played freely near the water tower in the afternoons. News traveled quickly in such a small town. If someone bought a new truck or had family visiting from another county, everyone knew about it before the day ended. Among the town's residents was Thomas Walker, a quiet rancher who owned a modest piece of land just outside Red Hollow. Thomas was known as a hard-working man who rarely caused trouble and kept mostly to himself. Since his wife had passed away several years earlier, he spent nearly all his time raising his 12-year-old son, Daniel. The two were often seen together in town, buying supplies, repairing equipment, or sharing a meal at the small diner on Main Street. Daniel Walker was very different from his father. Where Thomas was quiet and reserved, Daniel was curious and full of questions. The boy loved exploring the woods surrounding the town and had a habit of wandering into places most people avoided. Lately, Daniel had become fascinated with the abandoned chapel at the edge of Red Hollow. He often asked older residents why the building had been left to decay and whether there was anything hidden beneath it. Most people simply told him to stay away from it, but the mystery only seemed to make the boy more interested. When morning arrived and the Walker home remained quiet, something immediately felt wrong. Normally, Thomas Walker was up before sunrise, already working outside on his ranch while Daniel prepared for another day of helping his father. But that morning the ranch looked completely still. A neighbor passing by noticed the front gate hanging slightly open and the house unusually silent. By midday, concern had begun spreading through Red Hollow, and several townspeople started asking the same uneasy question. Where were Thomas and Daniel Walker? By the afternoon, the town sheriff, Harold Bennett, had been informed. Bennett was a tall, stern man who had served as sheriff of Red Hollow for nearly 15 years. He was known for keeping the town quiet and under control, and most people trusted his judgment without question. After hearing that the Walkers had not returned home the previous night, Bennett quickly organized a small search party made up of local ranchers and volunteers. Their first stop was the place neighbors had last seen the father and son heading toward, the abandoned chapel at the edge of town. As the group approached the old building, the sight of Thomas Walker's dusty pickup truck immediately caught everyone's attention. It was parked just outside the chapel doors, exactly where someone would leave it if they were only planning to stay a few minutes. The truck's engine was cold, and the keys were still inside. This alone was enough to make the search party uneasy. Thomas Walker was not the type of man to simply leave his vehicle behind, especially with his young son somewhere nearby. Sheriff Bennett slowly pushed open the large wooden doors of the chapel. The hinges groaned loudly as sunlight spilled into the dark interior. Inside, everything looked abandoned and untouched. Dust covered the long wooden pews, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. Broken stained glass windows allowed thin beams of colored light to shine across the floor. At first glance, there were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no obvious clue about what had happened the night before. But as the sheriff walked closer to the altar, something unusual caught his eye. A large, worn-out rug lay across the wooden floor, but it didn't sit flat like the rest of the room's dusty surfaces. One side of it appeared slightly folded, as if it had been dragged aside and then quickly pushed back into place. Sheriff Bennett stared at it for a moment longer than expected, his expression suddenly tightening. Then he quietly told the search party that it was nothing important and ordered them to continue searching the woods around the chapel instead. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Thomas and Daniel Walker slowly became the most unsettling mystery Red Hollow had ever known. At first, The townspeople remained hopeful that the father and son would somehow return. Search parties continued exploring nearby forests, abandoned barns, and dry riverbeds. Posters with their names were placed in nearby towns, and travelers were asked if they had seen any sign of them. But as time passed with no answers, hope slowly began to fade, leaving behind a growing sense of unease that settled over the town. The story of their disappearance soon became the subject of quiet conversations in the local diner, the general store, and even after Sunday services. Some people believed the two had simply wandered too far into the wilderness and gotten lost somewhere beyond the surrounding hills. Others suggested darker possibilities, whispering that someone passing through town might have been responsible. But none of these theories truly explained why their truck had been left behind at the chapel, or why there had been no sign of struggle inside the building. Before long, the mysterious chapel itself became the center of every rumor. Older residents began sharing stories that many younger people had never heard before. According to town records, the chapel had been built in the late 1800s by a small group of settlers who arrived in Red Hollow long before most of the current families lived there. Some locals claimed the settlers chose that exact location for a reason, though no one seemed to agree on what that reason was. Others insisted the chapel had been constructed over something much older, something that existed long before the town itself. A few elderly townspeople even spoke about a hidden structure beneath the building. They claimed that when the chapel was first built, workers had discovered an underground chamber beneath the ground. According to the story, the chamber had later been sealed off and forgotten. Over the years, the tale had turned into little more than a local legend, something parents would mention to scare children away from wandering too close to the abandoned building after dark. Whenever these stories reached Sheriff Bennett, however, he reacted the same way every time. He dismissed them immediately, telling everyone the rumors were nothing but old ghost stories. The sheriff insisted that investigators had already searched the chapel thoroughly after the walkers disappeared and that there was absolutely nothing hidden beneath it. Yet despite his confidence, some residents couldn't ignore the strange way his voice sometimes tightened whenever the chapel was mentioned. As the years passed, life in Red Hollow slowly returned to its quiet routine. New families moved into town, children grew up, and the memory of the Walker disappearance faded into an old story people only mentioned occasionally. Yet one thing never changed. The abandoned chapel still stood at the edge of town, slowly falling apart under decades of wind and sun. While most residents avoided the place simply because it looked unsafe, others stayed away for a different reason. Something about the building made people uncomfortable, though few could explain exactly why. Sheriff Harold Bennett continued serving as the town's lawman through all those years. He was respected for keeping order in such a small community, but some townspeople quietly began noticing certain patterns in his behavior. Whenever discussions about renovating the chapel came up at town meetings, Bennett immediately opposed the idea. He always claimed the building was too unstable and dangerous for anyone to enter. Instead of allowing repairs, he insisted the chapel should simply be left alone. What made his reaction stranger was how seriously he treated the matter. On more than one occasion, local ranchers offered to remove the collapsing structure and clear the land entirely. Each time, Bennett firmly rejected the suggestion. He argued that the building was part of Red Hollow's history and should remain untouched. But some residents couldn't help noticing that the sheriff seemed unusually tense whenever the chapel was mentioned, as if the idea of disturbing it made him deeply uneasy. One night in the early 1960s, a group of teenage boys from town decided to test the rumors surrounding the old building. Armed with flashlights and a lot of nervous excitement, they drove out to the chapel just after midnight. The plan was simple: go inside, explore for a few minutes, and prove to everyone that the place was nothing more than an empty, abandoned structure. But just as they stepped through the creaking front doors, the distant sound of a car engine approached from the road. Moments later, Sheriff Bennett's patrol car stopped outside the chapel. The boys were shocked to see him there so quickly, as if he had somehow known they were coming. When he stepped out of the car, his usual calm expression was gone. Witnesses later said he looked pale and furious at the same time. He ordered the teenagers out of the building immediately and personally locked the chapel doors before warning them never to return. But as he stood there in the darkness, holding the keys tightly in his hand, the fear in his eyes seemed far stronger than his anger. By the year 2022, Red Hollow had changed in many ways. The once tiny town had slowly grown. New buildings had replaced old wooden shops, and paved roads now ran through areas that had once been nothing but dust and farmland. Most of the people who remembered the disappearance of Thomas and Daniel Walker were either very old or had long since passed away. To the younger generation, The story had become little more than a strange local legend told by grandparents during quiet evenings. The abandoned chapel, however, still stood exactly where it always had, at the far edge of town, surrounded by tall weeds and leaning slightly from decades of neglect. Its wooden walls were now badly cracked, parts of the roof had collapsed, and the stained glass windows had completely shattered. Over the years, storms and strong Texas winds had slowly weakened the structure. Many residents believed it was only a matter of time before the entire building finally collapsed. Eventually, the town council decided something had to be done. Engineers inspected the chapel and warned that the structure had become dangerously unstable. If it were to fall unexpectedly, it could harm anyone passing nearby. After several discussions, the council approved a plan to demolish the building and clear the land. For the first time in decades, workers were officially given permission to enter the chapel and begin preparing the area for demolition. Early one morning, a small construction crew arrived with tools and equipment. The inside of the chapel looked even worse than expected. The wooden pews had rotted, the floorboards creaked loudly under every step, and pieces of the ceiling had fallen onto the dusty ground. Sunlight streamed through the broken roof, casting long beams of light across the old altar where the large rug still lay in place, faded and worn after so many years. As the workers began removing loose boards near the front of the chapel, one of them noticed something unusual beneath the floor close to the altar. When a section of wood was pulled away, the worker suddenly froze and called the others over. Beneath the dusty boards was a solid metal surface, something that clearly did not belong to the original structure. After brushing away years of dirt and debris, they realized they were looking at a heavy iron hatch built directly into the ground, its edges sealed tight and its rusted surface marked with faint, nearly unreadable letters. When the authorities finally arrived at the chapel, the entire area was quickly sealed off. Police officers, local officials, and a small team of historians gathered around the rusted iron hatch beneath the chapel floor. The heavy metal surface looked ancient, its edges thick with rust from decades of being sealed shut. As workers carefully wiped away layers of dust and dirt, the faded lettering stamped into the metal became clearer. The word CRYPT could still be read, followed by a date that seemed almost unbelievable, 1891. For several long moments, no one spoke. The small crowd stood silently, staring down at the hatch as if unsure whether opening it was truly a good idea. Finally, one of the officers nodded to the workers, giving them permission to proceed. Using metal tools, they slowly forced the hatch open. The hinges groaned loudly, echoing through the empty chapel as the heavy lid lifted for the first time in more than a century. A sudden rush of cold, stale air escaped from the darkness below, carrying the smell of damp stone and something far older. Beneath the hatch was a narrow stone staircase descending deep into the ground. The steps were rough and uneven, carved from old grey stone that looked far older than the chapel itself. Flashlights flickered on one by one as investigators prepared to go down. The beams of light cut through the darkness as they slowly made their way underground, each step echoing faintly through the hidden chamber below. At the bottom of the staircase, the group entered a small stone room. The walls were damp and covered with patches of moss, and the ceiling was supported by thick wooden beams that had darkened with age. The air inside felt heavy and still, as if the chamber had remained completely undisturbed for generations. Old wooden boxes and broken tools lay scattered along the edges of the room, suggesting that this place had once been used long before the chapel was built above it. Then someone's flashlight beam moved toward the far corner of the chamber, and suddenly stopped. Leaning against the stone wall were two human skeletons. One was clearly the remains of a grown man, while the other was much smaller, no more than a child. Beside them lay an old rusted lantern and what appeared to be a revolver, its metal surface corroded with time. But what truly froze everyone in place was the message carved deeply into the stone wall above the bones, the letters rough and uneven as if someone had scratched them there in desperation. The discovery inside the crypt sent shockwaves through the town of Red Hollow. Within hours, the story spread across the entire community, drawing reporters, investigators, and curious residents to the area surrounding the old chapel. Police quickly secured the site and began examining the remains carefully. Early evidence suggested what many had already begun to suspect. The skeletons likely belonged to Thomas Walker and his young son Daniel, the father and son who had vanished 80 years earlier without a trace. As investigators continued studying the chamber, they focused on the disturbing message carved into the stone wall. The words looked rough and uneven, as if someone had desperately scratched them into the surface with a sharp object. The first line was chilling enough on its own. He locked us in. But directly beneath it, another sentence appeared even more unsettling. "The sheriff knows." Those 3 words instantly raised questions about Sheriff Harold Bennett, the man who had led the search for the missing pair all those years ago. Curious about the sheriff's possible connection, investigators began digging through old town records and archived documents. They reviewed newspaper reports from 1942, witness statements from the original search, and any records connected to the chapel. Slowly, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. According to several old reports, Sheriff Bennett had been the last known person seen near the chapel on the same night Thomas and Daniel disappeared. At the time, no one had questioned his presence there, since he was responsible for keeping order in the town. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story became. Hidden among the sheriff's old belongings, which had been stored by distant relatives after his death decades earlier, they discovered a small locked notebook. The pages were worn and yellowed with age, filled with brief notes about daily patrols and routine events around Red Hollow. But near the middle of the notebook was an entry dated July 18, 1942, the same night the father and son vanished. The entry was written more hurriedly than the others, the handwriting uneven as if the sheriff had been nervous while writing it. The short passage described how Thomas Walker and his son had discovered something inside the chapel that evening, something hidden beneath the altar floor. According to the sheriff's own words, the boy had been the first to notice it. The final lines of the entry hinted that the two had begun asking questions about what was buried under the chapel, questions the sheriff apparently believed should never be answered. As the investigation continued, the mystery surrounding Red Hollow only grew darker. The sheriff's notebook raised more questions than it answered, and many parts of the story still didn't make sense. Why had Sheriff Bennett been so desperate to keep the crypt sealed? And what exactly had Thomas and Daniel Walker discovered beneath the chapel that night in 1942? Forensic teams confirmed that the remains found inside the crypt were almost certainly those of the missing father and son. The position of the skeletons suggested they had tried to escape but were trapped with no way out. The rusted lantern beside them indicated they had survived in the darkness for some time, waiting and hoping someone would come to rescue them. But no help ever arrived, because the one man who knew they were there had chosen to keep the secret buried. Yet even after the crypt was opened and the truth about their fate was revealed, one question still haunted the investigators. Inside the sheriff's notebook, that final sentence continued to trouble everyone who read it. It wasn't empty. Those 3 words suggested that when Thomas and Daniel first discovered the underground chamber, something was already there before them. Something that Sheriff Bennett believed should never be uncovered. To this day, historians and investigators still debate what the sheriff meant. Some believe he was referring to old remains or forgotten relics buried beneath the town long before the chapel was built. Others believe the sheriff had discovered something far more disturbing, something that forced him to seal the crypt and silence anyone who came too close to the truth. But the most chilling part of the story is this. When the investigators first opened the crypt in 2022, they found signs that parts of the chamber had once extended deeper underground, passages that had long since collapsed. And whatever may have existed beyond those sealed tunnels was never fully explored. Even now, the land where the chapel once stood remains quiet. The wind moves through the empty fields of Red Hollow just like it did back in 1942. And some people in town still believe that the sheriff wasn't only hiding a crime. They believe he was hiding something much worse.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.